Lea Ypi, welcome to the Expeditions Book Club, where we're going to be talking today about memoir, that extraordinarily capacious and elastic form that allows for all kinds of explorations. But that's not where you began. You didn't begin with Free, that wonderful, wonderful memoir of your childhood in Albania, which goes on to a moment of economic collapse, really, or this wonderful book, Indignity. You began by writing academic books of a philosophical nature. Some of them, I think, are probably too difficult for me. um, One on the critique of pure reason on Kant, called, tell me what it was called.
The Architectonic of Reason.
The Architectonic of Reason, which is a great title. I'm going to have to read it, but I'm going to have great concentration to do that. And another one on agency and political action and the avant-garde and global justice and all these big themes, which I know we covered a little bit in the expeditions filming. But now you've moved into the world of memoir, and you've done really quite extraordinary books with this. So I want to know, first of all, what led you to that form? How did you leap into the memoir form, and what informed that desire, really?
First of all, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you, Lisa. So what led me to memoir? I'd say first is chance. I set out to write a philosophical book about freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions, very much along the lines of my other academic books. But I started doing so during COVID. And so at some point there was an emergency, lockdown, the libraries were closed, research activities were suspended. And I ended up writing this philosophical book I had set out to write from a cupboard in Berlin because my small children were running around the house and were looking for me. And so to hide from them, I ended up in this cupboard, which was large because it was a German cupboard, but still a cupboard. And it occurred to me at that point that there are moments in our lives where the macro and the micro meet. And so where actually philosophical ideas of freedom and the lived reality of freedom or unfreedom in that case become one and the same thing, and that there is a way of exploring these philosophical concepts through lives. And it also occurred to me from this cupboard in Berlin that there had been another time of my life where I had felt the same, as though what was going on, philosophical discussions around freedom in society and crisis and democracy, and what I was experiencing in my individual life were the same thing. And that was when the wall had come down and the regime was changing in Albania. So there was this moment of COVID where I thought about crisis and what it means to write under crisis and what it means to write about philosophical ideas, but through the lens of individual experiences. And suddenly this philosophical book I had set out to write about freedom in the liberal and in the socialist traditions became a memoir of my childhood and of these discussions around freedom that I had experienced as a child.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that, because when I read it, I thought to myself, this is actually the best book that I have ever read of living within a regime that tries to make you unfree in terms of the family and in terms of what children and parents undergo. And I thought the child's point of view was extraordinary. Now, you say you were surrounded by your children running around. Did that make any difference to how you conceived of yourself as a girl living in this very different world?
Yeah, I think at some point, perhaps both being able to be reminded of what it means to be a child and having these children run around perhaps was a very vivid reminder of that condition, but also in terms of recovering a way of looking at the world, which is not the adult perspective. And especially when you're thinking about freedom in crisis or freedom in transition and contested ideas of what freedom means when we are really free, are particularly effective from the point of view of a narrator who doesn't have their own view of freedom. A child just registers adults, their conversations, what they say, how they navigate these circumstances. And that naivety, that standpoint of that naivety, was to me very important in being able to write about freedom in a non-dogmatic way, or in a way that wasn't wedded to any particular way of understanding, or to any positive definition of it, but was trying to rather recover different meanings and different experiences.
of course, it's very interesting because there is no necessary history to a child's experience of freedom or unfreedom. And the character, I call her a character because when one thinks of oneself as a child, of course, one's created a character of sorts because memory is a very elastic and imaginative capacity. And the character that you create, in fact, fights for her memory of freedom, which is a communist and rather, in our terms, certainly now, a very restricted view of freedom. Did that surprise you when it happened?
Yes, yes and no, in the sense that I was trying to think about what was it like for this child to look at this world from the inside, thinking that she was living in the freest country in the world, where in fact this was one of the most oppressive, tyrannic regimes the world has ever known. And what was important to me in thinking about the child perspective was the fact that the child doesn't necessarily have a political position, and so therefore can't really experience censorship and the kind of censorship that her parents experience, that her family experiences. For a child, the question of freedom is the question of, is this street safe to play in? Does this dog bite or not? Can I go to school by myself? And there is a sort of immediacy to this experience of freedom that we then lose as adults and that we no longer think of anymore, because actually the experience, the personal condition of freedom becomes bound up with the political condition and with the condition of society, whereas
I
the
love
child just pervades.
I love the way you have, I think it's your parents, perhaps it's your grandmother, using these different, I don't know, formulations to talk about the fact that people have been jailed or have been done away with. Can you remember those formulations? Because they were
Yeah.
perfect.
Yes, absolutely. There was this moment where I could hear these conversations around various family relatives that had gone to university. And I lived in, and I was growing up in a dissident family without knowing it, because my parents were not speaking openly in my presence, but what they were using was code language. And so they would say, for someone who had gone to prison, they would say they went to university. And if they said something like they dropped out, it meant the person had committed suicide. If they said they'd been studying for X amount of years, that was usually the prison sentence that they had received and the duration of that. And even the different kind of charges, there was a code for them. And so if they said they studied economics, it meant that someone had been sentenced for crimes related to property. If they said they studied international relations, it was agitation and propaganda. So it was a very sophisticated, very elaborate code, which I reconstruct and I introduce in the book without explaining for the readers what it is, just the way I heard it and the way adults discussed it.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant. I mean, one of the things that struck me is that when the book actually takes you through into the end of communism and this extraordinary pyramid capitalist structure that emerges, that you've described this in a way which is, again, because the child is there, extremely powerful. And did you plan this? I mean, did you know from the beginning that free would take you into this form of neoliberal economics?
Well, I had a sense that I wanted to write about this experience of transition and what freedom meant in these different contexts. But I wouldn't say that I knew the narrative voice before I started writing the book. I very much discovered it in the process of writing, and it surprised me that it was taking me in this direction. And I was hearing myself, it sounds very funny when I say, but I was hearing myself speak in this voice and in these words. And that's where I think your description of my character is very appropriate, because although I was a writer, I was also the character about whom I was writing.
So when you finished that book, presumably, I mean, I say this because I recognize it in my own writing. When I finished writing Losing the Dead, I thought, there's so much that I haven't done. And did you feel that at the end of Free, that you really had to go back to your grandmother's life?
Yeah, I felt that there were themes that had emerged that I hadn't quite explained. And maybe I couldn't really explain with the voice of the child, because although the voice opened a perspective that I had not anticipated and enabled me to write about these questions in ways that I had not anticipated, it was very much, there were also other questions that you couldn't tackle from a child's perspective. And so in a way, that's where the next book, Indignity, picks up where Free left off, where Free was about these different ideas of freedom, and Dignity is about one particular idea of freedom that was central in my grandmother's character. And I don't think that idea of freedom I could have unpacked with a child's voice. That's why I needed to then move on to something different.
So tell us about this idea of dignity, which I know is very important to you and comes from Kant in one of your quotations as well. So
yeah, in fact, the epigraph of the book is a quote from Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, where he says everything has either a price or a dignity. And for Kant, dignity is something that is given to us by our capacity for moral agency. And that capacity for moral agency is central also in the other book, in Free. Through the character of my grandmother, I unpack what it means to think that freedom consists in this posing your ends and trying to realize them in a world that is not always compatible with how you would like those ends to be pursued. And so she's someone who tries to make moral decisions and thinks that freedom consists in making these moral decisions. And yet she lives in a time of transition and fluctuation and regime change, where it's actually really hard to be a moral agent. And what Indignity does is to exactly put pressure on this idea of freedom as moral agency and dignity as that which is encapsulated through this notion of freedom as moral agency, and to explore what that means in these times of extreme where she lives, where one sees the changes in different regimes.
So just to move back one moment from your grandmother, I mean, one of the extraordinary things about Indignity is how much history it actually manages to cover. And I'm very impressed by the memoir's ability to do this, to somehow, by having people being alive within times, actually manages to compress huge amounts of history. So can we begin, first of all, by you giving us a little bit of the backdrop, because it's not a part of the world that's very well known here, where your grandmother comes from, and it's very tangled and important.
Yeah, you're right. And Indignity really tries to actually keep all of these threads together. On the one hand, the personal life of this woman that lives and in this turbulent moment of history and experiences all the tragedies of the 20th century in her personal life. It's also a political history of the Balkans, from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to the collapse of communism. And it's also a philosophical effort to unpack what dignity means and what it means to live with dignity and maintain one's dignity in these times of extreme. And her life, you're right, becomes the prism through which one can see this, because she grew up in Thessaloniki in Greece, was born just a few years before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and Thessaloniki was one of the vibrant, lively centers, a cosmopolitan, multicultural, both political and trading imperial center. And you see through her life the collapse of this cosmopolitan, multicultural, imperial ethos and its replacement with the ethos of the nation state. And through the history of the substitution of this imperial ethos with the ethos of the nation state, also the harm that is done to different communities who had to find another way of negotiating their political relations, and also the harm to individuals who suddenly have to answer this question, who are you, in a way that is very different from how they might have answered it before.
And some of these people are actually actively engaged in politics. Your grandfather, for instance, and your grandmother to an extent too, although she seems a bit more of a, what I call free spirit, although maybe not freedom in that sense, in a Henry Jamesian sense. So tell us a little bit about the family's engagement with politics in what by then is Albania.
So Leman, my grandmother, came from this aristocratic Albanian family, but most of her ancestors, their fortunes were bound up with the fortunes of the Ottoman Empire, because they had been high administrators and posted in different provinces from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. And this also gives you a sense of how vast the Ottoman Empire was. And so although she knew herself to be Albanian, in fact, at home everyone spoke French, as all aristocrats did in those days. Her husband, my grandfather, came from a similar family, but in his case, his father had also been involved in the Albanian politics of the early years after independence from the Ottoman Empire. And though my grandfather was a socialist who had been involved in the Popular Front and studied in France and was active in the years of the election of Leon Blum, when you had this united left of communists and socialists, actually the father was a fascist conservative collaborator who was prime minister of Albania at the time in which Albania was invaded by Italy. And so the family history and the fortunes of individuals and their conflicts and clashes, including clashes between generations, so the younger generation versus the older generation, become also a way of thinking about how these different generations negotiate these conflicts and how they think about what dignity is from a conservative perspective, from a progressive perspective, from the perspective of a free spirit, as you said.
So it occurred to me again while reading this that you could have written this entire book as a novel, and it would have been an extraordinary family saga against a backdrop of these very entangled politics and indeed historical moments and 2 world wars and, lots going on. But you've chosen to do it as an investigator, a researcher into this past, a researcher who is both, if you like, objective, whatever that means, and as a family member. And I want to know about that choice. I mean, why did you make that choice rather than the novelistic choice, which would have allowed you, in some ways, a different kind of more?
Yeah, I think I really wanted to also raise in the book a methodological question, which is the relationship between history and literature. And the book does that at the level of form because it fluctuates. It has 2 narrative voices, one in the first person, which narrates the story of a granddaughter who is looking for the truth around her grandmother's life through a series of visits to this Secret Service archive.
That could have been fiction too.
Albania. But there are a series of documents, and so there is a desire to find the truth based on the documents and by reading these surveillance reports and so on. And it is driven by the demands of nonfiction in many ways, where you're bound by what you find and so on. On the other hand, there's a third-person narrative voice where an author that writes it reads like a novel, like a historical novel, writes in the third person. The characters are all mentioned by their first names, and there is a lot of literary license. There's a lot of reimagining of context and scenes and characters and dialogues, which of course I didn't witness in the first person. And the book oscillates, shifts between one and the other, because I wanted to have the reader understand that there is a difference between how the historian writes and how the novelist writes, and yet the boundaries between the novel and the historical account sometimes are porous boundaries, and sometimes we read a non-fiction report, a surveillance document, and we think, well, this is a fiction of the state of sorts. And on the other hand, you can read the novelist's account and you think, well, there's a kind of authenticity there, there's a sincerity of aims, and in that sense there is also a desire to find the truth. And I wanted that back and forth to be constantly present in the book.
So my fantasy about this, because we're talking about writing to a certain extent, my fantasy about this is that you might have tried the first form first, realized it didn't take you far enough, and elaborated it into fiction. Is that the case, or was it the other way around? Or did you know everything from the beginning?
No, I mean, when I went to the documents, I realized there were a lot of gaps. And so, but I also wanted to ask the question of why there are these gaps. What are these archives not telling us, and what is the reason for why they're not telling us? And often it's because they were documents that concerned women. Women weren't even juridical subjects for a really long time, so there's very little that can be really relied upon. There are sometimes documents that are written in light of the ideology of the system that they want to consolidate, whether it's communism in Albania or nationalism in Greece. And so there are reasons for why there are these silences of the archive. And I wanted to make that question explicit. And I also realized that literature gives you the tools to answer it and to suggest an answer that goes to a different part of the human and that says, well, that can ask this question of power in a way that the nonfiction doesn't enable you to do in many ways.
It's very interesting. When I was reading your initial encounter with the archive and your character, Lea Ypi, is very, very moved by what she finds. The documents really are there. Now, I remember that moment because I never, I'm not a historian. I came out of literature. I never had that kind of respect for documents. Archives, well, it's a great imaginary source, but still. And yet, when I found a piece of paper from a different time telling me that, yes, these people existed, I was actually very moved by it. And you are in the archive, and I imagine that's true. I mean, that was the
absolutely.
case.
And one other reason why I was very moved was that for me it was, for example, when I found documents that were written and signed by my grandmother. So letters that she handwritten letters where she was pleading the authorities to enable her to do certain things, or where she was asking, please don't deport me by this date because I have a mother that just passed away and I'm a single and my husband is in prison. And I realized there was a voice there, and there were concerns that wasn't exactly the same voice that had spoken to me as a granddaughter. That there was a part of this person that I actually didn't know at all, and that was only contained in these letters, and a vulnerability to her, which somehow I had not really thought about, because whenever she told me stories of her past life and how hard it was, there was always a kind of pedagogical purpose. They were told for my sake. There was a grandmother who spoke to the granddaughter and wanted her to take certain lessons away. And when I found those letters, there was a very vulnerable woman, but not a grandmother there. There was someone else. And I was moved because I realized there had been parts of her life and of her concerns that I just had no access to until I found those documents. And with those documents, then I was reimagining and trying to think about what it must have been like to live this life.
Well, let's go into this archival search and research. Describe it for us, because you're in a country which has recently been a different kind of country. And we've had a lot of Stasi fiction and writing, memoir, whatever. But we haven't had anything about Albania. And it occurred to me that it felt slightly different in your narrative. So just elaborate it a bit.
Well, I would say in many cases, the process is similar, but also different in that in all post-communist countries, in all East European contexts, there is a question around lustration, around the relationship with these files of the past, most of which were secret. And there are questions around existing living politicians, for example, or people who are still there who might have a past as Secret Service collaborators. And there's a question of what do we do with them? How do we relate to this traumatic past, knowing the level of complicity also with the regimes? And there are discussions around lustration and around how one accesses the files that are very similar. There are specificities because different countries have decided to make the files accessible at different points. And there's a sense in which the earlier this was done, the less likely the process was to be manipulated in the present by current political elites. And of course, there's also other philosophical questions that are raised by what do we get by accessing these very traumatic histories and these very traumatic lives, and how much can we actually rely on these documents to reconstruct, to think about the present and to reconstruct human relations in the present. And in Albania, like many other post-communist societies, there is a somewhat naive belief that if we can find the truth about what happened to victims of communism in the past, then we will find reconciliation. But of course, this only works if there is a truth to find and if you can trust the mechanisms through which that truth is transmitted. And one of the concerns and one of the issues that is constantly present in Indignity is the fact that we can't really rely on the documents as much because they're full of mistakes. They're written from one standpoint. There is always a perspective there that is not necessarily aligned with the perspective of the narrator. And the question is, what do you do with this information? How can you navigate this tension? And how can you tell a story that is, yes, grounded on these facts, but also has a kind of moral authenticity that the documents don't have?
Yes, because in fact, the documents themselves are a form of statecraft.
Absolutely. And there is almost a fiction of the archive as well. There's a kind of aesthetic of the archive. There's an intervention there. And this is where it becomes, for me, this is where this question of the relationship between history and literature becomes so interesting. Because here you are with a file that we go to because we think it contains the truth, and then you discover that it has someone's perspective, someone's standpoint, and it's in many ways a fiction. But you also, with literature, you are in the presence of a document that says, look, I am a lie, I'm fiction, I'm created. And yet it has a kind of aspiration to sincerity and authenticity and reconstructing of human motives, where there might be more truth than in the truth of the archive.
Yes. I mean, I guess archives are different if they're not state archives. I mean, if you had found a cache of correspondence between Enver Hoxha and your great-grandfather, it would have been a different kind of thing. It would still have been statecraft, but there might have been different.
Yeah, but for example, there's one in the book, there is a letter that I cite of my grandfather when he came out of prison. He writes a letter to Enver Hoxha in which he says, look, I went to prison for 15 years, now I would please ask for a job, because he was unemployed and so. And even there, it's a private letter, we have it at home. I don't really know about the motives of this letter. What was it written in this way because it had to be written in a way that's to please authorities or to make Hoxha feel a certain way about their relationship. And so we don't quite know the inner workings of the writer of that letter in a way. And the way to have access to it is somehow through literature.
So tell me what your next book is.
Well, I'm working at the moment on a sequel to Free called Equal, which explores also themes of equality and integration and migration, but starts where Free left off with my journey to Italy and my experiences of migration, but that also of many other migrants that I encountered in the process.
Wow. Okay. So, Lea, give us a sense through the book, give us a little reading about the archive itself. Choose anything you like.
Thank you.
And you can hop and skip.
It took many visits to the archives to grasp all this, to learn to tolerate something I found unbearable at the beginning, a question that awaited me at every turn like a tacky welcome mat at the entrance. Welcome to historical injustice. Do you want to uncover the real name of the collaborators? Know who is behind Tribune, March Wind, the Pelivan? Of all those random strangers who pieced together my grandmother's life story, like medieval craftsmen assembling a stained glass window. One prayer, one surveillance at a time, one element in the overall design carefully slotted into place. Occasionally, a piece of glass breaks. A life is shattered. Do you want to know who it was? The archivists keep pressing me, as if naming names could somehow help to mitigate the damage.
Lea, that's brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to go back and reread the book in your own voice again. Or I'll try. That was so good. I'm really looking forward to Equal.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come and do another expedition with us.
That'll be great. Yeah.